Anyone that has a slight understanding of Chinese history will know how much warfare exists in the 5,000-year history of her civilization. As such, Chinese poetry, like any other poetry, as an expression of one's emotional or philosophical ideals, speaks plenty on the theme of warfare, perhaps even more so than others. Today, we'll look at one such poem written during one of the bloodiest warfare in human history, the poem 春望, or Spring Views. First, let us listen to the Chinese version. 春望，杜甫。国破山河在，城春草木深。感时花溅泪，恨别鸟惊心。烽火连三月，家书抵万金。白头搔更短，浑欲不胜簪。Here is my English version. Spring View by Du Fu. The nation broken, yet rivers and mountains endure. In ruined spring, grass and trees grow deep. Moved by the times, tears fall at the sight of flowers. Parting still stings, even bird sounds startle the heart. The war fire burns for a third long month. A letter from home, worth more than mountains of gold. White hair thins beneath a restless hand. So few remain, they slip past the comb. When speaking about this poem, we must first talk about the historical background in which it was composed. Now, this is not a history video, so I will not go too into depth into the Anlushan Rebellion, as the entire event is absurdly complicated with lots of moving pieces. All you need to know for now is that this civil war, which lasted around 8 years, ended with a death toll similar to that of World War I. It was extremely bloody and complicated, and was the primary reason for the downfall of the Tang dynasty. This poem was composed in March of the second year of the Civil War. The year before, in June, the rebel forces of the Anlushan Rebellion invaded Chang'an, setting the city ablaze and reducing the once prosperous capital to ruins. In August of that same year, Du Fu had arranged for his wife to stay in the Qiang village in Fuzhou, while he himself traveled north to Lingwu to take refuge and join the forces of the imperial army. Unfortunately, he was captured during the journey by the rebels and was taken to the fallen city of Chang'an, where he remained captive for over half a year. It was in late spring, during this period of displacement, that he composed this now celebrated poem. The overall structure of the poem can be divided into two quatrains, with the first depicting the desolate and ruined springtime scene in the pillaged Chang'an, and the second expressing the poet's concerns and longings for his family and the fate of the nation. The opening line is very interesting in its wording, 国破山河在, meaning that even though the nation had fallen into ruins, the land, the mountains, and rivers of the nation still remains unbothered and unchanged. This continues into 城春草木深, that during springtime, the wild weeds and trees grow wild within the ravaged capital without a care. Nature is indifferent to human suffering and human conflicts, and yet during his captivity by a hostile force, nature is all that he has. The bustling capital might have been reduced to silence and decay, but the wind still stirs the leaves, flowers still bloom, and birds still sing, which create this emotional contrast between the consistency of the landscape and the impermanence of human affairs, that the poet in this moment of despair and loneliness tries to turn to the natural world, not necessarily for comfort, but for perhaps some sort of understanding or acknowledgement from nature of his suffering. Yet he has none, because, again, nature is indifferent to human suffering. I also need to point out the brilliance behind the use of the character 破, which means something broken or shattered, and in this case, that thing is 国, or the nation. This is something that many Westerners, or just non-Chinese in general, may not understand or get, which is the existence of this inherent nationalism in the minds of the people of China, that the government, or the nation, is the representation of the people. This concept isn't identical to the modern Western nationalism, which is often defined by ethnicity, territory, or the idea of a social contract. Chinese nationalism, or national identity, is, on the other hand, in my opinion, a sentiment that began way back during the Warring State period, when more than a dozen of quote-unquote city-states going at it with one another throughout a period of over 500 years. During that time, it is clear that there must be strong unity and nationality within each city-state, because if you are in any way internally weakened, you will be attacked and conquered by outsiders, which is almost always much worse than most forms of self-governance. And in the minds of the Chinese people, having lived through many civil wars in our 5,000 years history, this has been proven once and once again. The state is not separate from the people, it is the shield and structure that ensures their continuity. When 国, the nation, is 破, broken, the implication is more than just the falling of the capital of the political structure, but the fragmentation of the people themselves. Are there exceptions? Of course. But even in those exceptions, which are usually by the end of a dynasty's lifetime, whether it was the Tang, Song, Ming, or the Boxer Rebellion during Qing, it was prefaced by this understanding that the current regime did not have the ability to protect the people from an outside force, along with general chaos in the country. Rebellion in those instances are therefore not an act against the idea of the state, but in defense of it, a way of restoring its rightful function, which was certainly not the case for Anlushan. The insurrection at Anlushan was not a corrective or defensive measure on the nation's structure, even though the system was deeply flawed at the time, because the primary function of the rebellion was a self-interested seizure of power that led to vast human suffering, the destruction of the capital, and a massive fracturing of Tang Dynasty's social and militaristic infrastructure that the dynasty never recovered. The poet was living under captivity and amid the psychological trauma of seeing the outcomes of this rebellion, where the nation, the 国, broken from within, being hollowed out from the inside. The po here as such is the crystallization of this cultural trauma, that the land still stands, the river still flows, but now there is no nation, no people to give them meaning. All of this are the emotional depths packed into those two characters, 国破. The second couplet corresponds to the indifference of nature we spoke about earlier. 感时花溅泪, where the poet watched the blossoming flowers in Chang'an, the beauty of it all in a ruined landscape and a ruined time, watching the cruel irony of the image, and cannot help but weep. Because for the poet, it is not simply that flowers are blooming, it is that they are blooming still, under this environment, as if nothing has changed and nothing matters. The persistence in beauty becomes a wound which he weeps for because of what it symbolizes, that the natural world moves on, even as the human world collapses. Similarly, in line 4, 恨别鸟惊心, that the bird song, which should signify life, renewal, or joy, strikes the heart of the poet with a kind of violence which the poet assigns to the bird songs himself. In reality, there is no anger or sadness or any of those reactions within the bird, because there is no recognition of human affairs from those creatures. And yet the poet hears despair because it is a reflection of his own internal reactions to the scenery itself. It is not that the flowers and birds cause him pain, but that they are witnesses who do not mourn, and that, in its own way, is worse for him. This is what Chinese poetics call 借景抒情, or using the scenery to express one's emotion. The poet captures the contradiction of beauty and suffering, of life continuing in the face of death, that the emotional charge of the line comes not from what the flowers or birds are, but from what they are not. They are not human, not wounded, not broken. And yet, they are seen, heard, and felt through the lenses of a man who are. The third couplet is the beginning of the second section of the poem, the more personal section. The poet first reflects on how the war had dragged on through an entire spring with no end in sight, that the fenghuo, or beacons used to alert for an invasion, had not ceased for 3 long months. At this point, Emperor Xuanzong had already fled to Shu, modern-day Sichuan, and Emperor Suzong had just ascended the throne, slowly stabilizing the political aspect of the imperial court. But militarily, the imperial Tang forces had yet to gain the upper hand in the war. Chang'an still remained under enemy occupation, and it was unclear how long the conflict would continue, which we know now is another 7 long years of war and death. The poet Du Fu had been detained in enemy territory for a few months at this point, and had received no word from his wife and children, not knowing if they were alive or dead, save for suffering. So think about how precious it would be to receive a letter from home under those circumstances, which is echoed by the sentiment 家书抵万金. A letter from home worth more than tens of thousands of gold, which I changed to worth more than mountains of gold, as it felt more poetic to me. The phrase is rich with sorrow and longing, as it conveys the poet's desperate yearning amid complete isolation, a heartfelt wish for even the smallest news from his loved ones, which I'm sure the sentiment still lives in the modern day. The final couplet, 白头搔更短，浑欲不胜簪, describes a state of deep anxiety and sorrow through the physical transformations of the poet without mentioning those emotions directly, in contrast with the second couplet, which kind of does the opposite, as it describes the emotions of despair directly without mentioning the reasoning head-on. The beacon fire had been burning months after months. No letter from home had arrived, and both national crisis and personal grief weighed heavily on his heart. Being caught between outer chaoses and inner torment, the poet, overwhelmed by helplessness and idleness, paces around the room, scratching his head in distraction and hesitation, effectively depicting the same motion as the English phrase, tearing your hair out. Slowly, his black hair had turned to white, youth had faded into weariness, having wandered through war-torn lands, and now, after months of captivity in Chang'an, his hair had grown even more sparse and meager, that he feels it could no longer hold the hairpin. Zan, for those who do not know, is a type of hair ornament used to fasten the hair, similar to the modern hairpins. In ancient China, men grew their hair long, and upon reaching adulthood, they would tie their hair up on the top of their head, and the hairpin was then inserted horizontally to secure the knot and prevent the hair from coming loose. From the collapse of the state and the separation from the family, the poet turns to his own aging and decline and uses it as a symbolism born from grief. Through this physical image of whitening and thinning hair, the reader can feel the same inner anguish and emotional exhaustion of the poet by visualizing his physical state. This poem, all in all, masterfully blends emotion with imagery, conveying profound feelings of sorrow, longing, and despair through subtlety, precision, and economy of language. Structurally, it is extremely tight and cohesive, especially in its usage of the regulated 5-character quatrain meter, the 五律正格, which I am not proficient enough in Chinese meters to talk about, but that is the common consensus of the poem's form when it comes to its application of the tonal patterns. The poem focuses on that central theme of view, the Wang, in the title of the poem, that all the internal turmoil is expressed through exterior events and visions. The poem begins with the distant, elevated view of the country and the city, gradually narrowing the perspective, moving from far to near, from external observations to internal conflicts, and conveys his grief and indignation in a restrained yet powerful manner. Each segment of imagery flows naturally into the next, slowly deepening the emotion step by step and creating a poetic realm that evokes both resonance and reflection. And most importantly, this poem captures a deeply personal yet universally shared emotional response shaped by the historical moment that repeats over and over again in history. It reflects the collective yearning of the people of the world, regardless of space and time, for peace and stability, and their love for their nation and civilization. Thank you so much for watching. I have a literary Discord that I made for y'all who want to discuss literature with me, and also a classical music Discord server if you're interested. I am Z, and thank you for watching.